There's some fabulous discussion around how much the Roaring Twenties, this famous period in American history, truly roared. There's this perception of the Roaring Twenties, the 1920s in the United States, being this prosperous, exciting, dynamic time. Look, we're going to talk about characteristics of the Roaring Twenties, the decade before Roosevelt comes to power, the decade leading up to the Great Depression, the decade leading up to the New Deal. And I'd like you to just keep thinking in your head, is the Roaring Twenties a really good name for this period? Were they really roaring? And if they were roaring at all, how strongly did they roar? And did they roar only for some people rather than others? Firstly, let's start with this idea. The Roaring Twenties refers to the period within the United States during 1920s, so from about 1920 to 1929. We might sometimes run across people even say the Roaring Twenties extended to 1919. I think that might be pushing a bit, so let's keep it nice and simple. If it's the 1920s, then it's part of the Roaring Twenties if it's in the United States. People don't really talk about the Roaring Twenties for other countries, although it does come up a little bit. You hear Roaring Twenties, you're thinking of the period that's characterised by unprecedented American confidence and wealth during the 1920s. Look, there have been other times where there have been great prosperity in the United States. So is the Roaring Twenties this period of unprecedented confidence and wealth? Plenty of people say it is, but you'll also find historians argue about that. Certainly it was a prosperous time, and it was a time of limited government regulation on business. And we've spoken a bit about that laissez-faire capitalism that existed under Republican administrations during the 1920s, under the governments of Harding, Coolidge, and finally Hoover. The presidencies between Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat. This limited government regulation was based on this ideological leaning in the United States to a sense of individualism, of making it on your own talents, on your own merits, without owing anyone anything. And this idea that we should be striving to provide a more prosperous, success-laden life, a more materially successful life for our children's generation. This idea that we can achieve a dream and be better, that we can make it to the top of the system without any help from government. The prosperity of the 1920s, which seems largely based in urban cities, and we see it represented in things like Art Deco architecture and so forth in the rising skyscrapers of the United States big cities. This prosperity was largely based upon America's fairly limited role in the First World War. America was only involved in the First World War from 1917 until 1918. The great powers that were competitors to the United States internationally, the British Empire, France, Germany, Russia, these countries experienced really tough economic times as a result of the war. The British Empire went from one of the world's greatest creditors, I think it was the world's greatest creditor nation, to the greatest debtor nation. The United States would become the greatest creditor nation. In other words, the country that most other countries owed money to. It lent the most money to others. Germany, forced to deal with reparations under the Treaty of Versailles, its economy destroyed. France, the countryside and economy is destroyed by 4 years of warfare, largely on its territory on the Western Front. Russia, the Russian Empire ceases to exist, becomes the Soviet Union, becomes the world's first communist state. The United States makes a lot of money, ultimately, out of World War I. They are the nation that sells the weapons, sells the oil, sells the metals. When the war is over, it's the United States that invests in the countries that are rebuilding. It's American loans that prop those countries up. It's American products that are sold to those countries when their own industries don't exist. So at this time, there's a huge amount of investment in new industries in the United States. There's a confidence that you'll get a job if you want one in the United States. It's the birth of the factory production line in the United States. It's the start of, very famously, the Ford Motor Company. So there's an investment in products in the United States for profit. There are plenty of people getting jobs in the big cities. It's a boom time for the United States economically. There's building going on, there's industry being invested in. Times look good. And as people earn more money, they spend more money. What are they spending their money on? Often consumer products. And one of the main consumer products we see in this era are radios. Radios are the luxury consumer product of their time. Every home has to have a radio. And this is later utilised by Franklin Delano Roosevelt during his presidency during the Great Depression in the 1930s, when he broadcast what he called fireside chats from the Oval Office in the White House, where he gave rousing speeches direct to the American people via radio. It's also the time in which we see the birth of Hollywood, the birth of the talkies movies. We see the growth of the film industry in the United States. We see the growth of the music industry as jazz takes off in the United States. And the number one product across the United States, that massive consumer-driven product, was the car. And with the car came roads, came petrol stations, came a whole car culture that exists to this day. Ironically, it was also the era of the prohibition. The United States government in the 1920s bans alcohol. Now, this is a different trend. We've been talking about how America doesn't want to interfere. American governments don't like to interfere in the lives of citizens, in the lives of business. Well, they did it overwhelmingly, a massive interference in the lives of people when they banned alcohol under the prohibition. They prohibited the sale of alcohol. So it becomes the gangster era. It's a time of illicit drinking, illicit speakeasy drinking clubs. It's a time of almost lawlessness and corruption and glamour. And we see this represented in the, artwork, in the dance. We also see it in literature such as F. Scott Fitzgerald's famous The Great Gatsby. There is a sense of puritanical nature, a Christian moralism that comes through an American government at times. It's quite interesting for a government that doesn't want to interfere in the lives of its citizens. Every now and then it really sticks its nose into the lives of its citizens from a Christian, moralistic, puritanical tradition, which is an entirely different theme that doesn't really belong in this unit. But it is interesting to note how America can get quite moralistic at times. When we're looking at this period that we call the Roaring Twenties, I would like you to keep thinking about who it roars for. The 1920s certainly is a time where the most privileged of US society gain more privilege. And who is that? Well, if you're white, you are in a much better, or have a much better chance of living a prosperous life in the 1920s than an African American. So these Roaring Twenties do not seem to really extend very much into African American communities, particularly those in the South. So when we're talking about the Roaring Twenties, we're really talking about prosperous, good times for white people living in northern cities. This privilege certainly is also gendered, that it is the men who are wealthiest. Women are just getting the right to vote in 1920 in the United States. Women are certainly playing a much greater role in society in the United States in the 1920s. But it was very much still a patriarchal society. Those issues of gender that you've dealt with in other units exist in the United States. While there is what is known as a Harlem Renaissance, where African Americans move from the South into northern cities and particularly into Harlem in New York City, and there is a explosion of jazz music and African American culture. This, I guess, prosperity of Roaring Twenties doesn't really extend into African American cultures, African American lives. A particular area of weakness is the rural sector of the United States, the Midwest, the farming areas of the United States. Those areas really did quite well while war was going on. American rural industry, farming industry was a big export industry when many of the farming industries of Europe were disrupted by warfare. That the food going into Europe, into Britain, into France during World War One rather, was largely coming out of the United States. So American farmers made money during the war and did quite well. But when the war was over, there was a contraction in purchases of American farm products around the world. There was also a spin-off, as many alcoholic drinks are based upon grain products or are based upon agricultural products. When the Americans shut down the alcohol industry, American farmers pay a huge price. So there is quite a lot of rural poverty that is a structural weakness to the United States' economy during the 1920s. Another structural weakness that's going on in the United States is that at this time of unprecedented confidence and prosperity, many Americans are looking to invest in American companies in the hope of making a profit. Now, these companies are certainly making a profit, but the buying of shares in those companies, the investing in those companies, is often done in a method of purchase called on the margin. Essentially, you could borrow money without any security to buy shares in a company. Now, this would mean that if for some reason your shares lost all value, you had no liquid assets to pay your debts. So you were borrowing on credit to buy shares in companies on the hope that those companies would continue to make a profit. So you were living on this artificial earnings or artificial value of some companies. If people suddenly felt that your company had no value, then your share in that company would have no value and you'd gone into debt to buy that. So large Americans, so I guess what I'm getting at is a lot of Americans had a huge amount of debt that they couldn't really pay back during this period. So it was unsecured debt. You weren't borrowing against, say, property you had. Banks were essentially giving you money that you would pay back some way down the track. And these debts were really quite high. Those debts, that consumer debt, was what was funding the Wall Street Stock Exchange's prosperity and investment in companies in New York. It was a time, and it's quite a complex concept, so we'll move on slightly from there. We can talk about it another time. But this was a time where Republican presidencies are secure in the White House, really, despite the fact there are scandals. Warren Harding is involved in an oil industry scandal called the Teapot Dome scandal. One of his executive appointments is the first American member of the executive branch appointed by a president to go to jail for bribery. Then there's Calvin Coolidge in the middle part of the 1920s, and then Herbert Hoover, who is the president of the United States, a Republican at the time of the Wall Street crash. And that's where we want to wrap this up here, because it's getting on a bit longer here. The Roaring Twenties come to an end in October 1929 with this thing called the Wall Street crash. It is a collapse in confidence at the New York Stock Exchange, where companies have their value measured and traded, if you like. And we'll talk a little in class about how stock exchanges work, how shares work, and so on. This Wall Street crash of October 1929 represents the start of an economic contraction called the Great Depression. It signals the collapse of the American economy, and because America was the largest creditor nation to the world, It then in turn leads to the collapse of the global economy. So when was this crash? Well, it's actually the period between what's called Black Thursday, the 24th of October 1929, through to Black Tuesday, the 29th of October 1929. The start of the Great Depression is what leads to the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt.